standard study drug. I'll show you, the University of Mississippi sends out, so this is after 7 years of struggle with the government, we finally received our study drug from NIDA. It comes out, it's frozen. It's like a frozen powder that arrives in these sandwich bags that are then dumped. We dump them out to weigh them, and you can see the consistency of this. It's almost like, it reminds me of a green talcum powder. They pulverize it in order to make it, in order to standardize it. But the problem is, and when Dr. Madras talked about how hard it is to keep, to persuade patients to participate in these trials, this is a big part of the reason why. This picture here, when patients who know what cannabis is supposed to be, and they see this study drug, it is very difficult to retain them in the study and persuade them to proceed to enrollment, or they may be enrolled and drop out quickly after. So this has been a big challenge. This is the actual flyer that's approved by the IRB. We are currently screening patients. We have, we're splitting the protocol between my site and Johns Hopkins. So they'll be enrolling half the patients in Baltimore at Hopkins, and I'll be enrolling the other half. And we are going to collect the most objective, unassailable data. This is the first and only randomized controlled trial in the world looking at whole plant cannabis for PTSD. But one thing I did want to point out is that even if we started, if we enrolled our first patient tomorrow, we still wouldn't have publishable data for 3 years. So this is important to know that these studies, this is a 2-year clinical trial. The data will be published during year 3, but you can see how, you can't, people who argue that we have to wait until we have more data may not realize how long these processes take. Look, we've already waited 7 years to get the study started. We have another 3 years to go till data is published. Again, this is early phase, it's only phase 2 trial. We really need phase 3 data. So you can see how you have sick and debilitated patients throughout the state right now who need compassionate access to exquisitely lab-tested cannabis. And I would encourage you to admit that the amount of controlled trials that already exist, there's already thousands of controlled trials published in peer-reviewed journals that already confirm the medical benefits of the different conditions that are listed in the constitutional amendment. And I would encourage you to embrace what the literature that's already out there that I would submit is already sufficient to justify the adding of these. I also want to point out that our trial is a $2.5 million project. So that's what these studies cost. A lot of legislators that I speak with around the country think that they can implement clinical trials with just $100,000 or $200,000 and get some things underway. I can assure you that you will not get through peer review with these kind of low fund. If you try to cut corners on money, the cheapest observational study that came out, the state of Colorado recently invested $9 million of their medical cannabis surplus money, and they plowed that into 8 different clinical trials. I thought that was a very wise investment, looking at efficacy of cannabis only, not funding any safety studies, because we know that we can count on NIDA to do these safety studies. Anyway, of the $9 million, the cheapest observational study that came out of that was $500,000, and it was a very underpowered observational study. Typically, observational studies will run $500,000 to $2 million, depending on the sample size. So it's just important for everyone here to be aware. I know we're all desperate to get access to good research, to objective data. If you want that, you've got to make a commitment to create a true accessible funding source here at the state level. You can't rely on the federal government. There is no efficacy money currently to study. There's no federal government money right now to study efficacy of cannabis. It's all of our studies have typically been privately funded, and the ability to leverage private dollars is really tough. So it would be the most sensible, forward-thinking for this legislature to create a mechanism, either through collecting licensing fees or whatever the model is, sales tax revenue, that you allocate and earmark a portion, guarantee that for cannabis efficacy trials. I guarantee that will catapult you to the forefront of the most important cannabis research in the country. If you really make a commitment to creating that kind of, endowment or whatever fund that you can to make it really well substantially funded. So I think with that, I will end. I just wanted to remind you that I am working in, I do serve as an independent medical director from Hawaii all the way to New York, so I am familiar with all the state programs and these different, I helped shape the regs in Arizona, for instance, and I would tell you that the Arizona model is a reasonable model to look at. We're a similar state to you guys in terms of our politics. We're very conservative. We have a giant senior citizen population, and we have managed to keep our program truly medical. We haven't veered in. We're now a 6-year-old medical cannabis program, and we have not veered into a recreational system. And I think there's a lot of best practices that you can learn from Arizona, from Maryland, from Nevada. There's a lot of great models out there. So let me stop, and I'm happy
Thank
to
you,
take
Dr. Sisley. Thank you. Members, I'll entertain questions for Dr. Sisley or any of the members of the panelists. I do want you to be aware that we have 10 individuals who've requested public comment time, and we do have a duty to include them. And I also want to point out that this is not the last meeting we're going to have with regard to this topic. So if there are any questions for Dr. Sisley? Yes, Representative Silvers, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Sisley. Appreciate your presentation. I was just wondering, I was taking notes during your presentation, how do other states work? Do physicians have to order a certain route of administration and dosage? Because a certain dosage, route of administration, and strain is going to be unique to each person, so
Yes.
it's going to be a bit of trial and error. So how do they do it in other states?
You're recognized to respond.
Sir, I think generally what's happened in other states is they have left it up to the patients working with their different dispensaries to learn as much as they can about the plant, to talk with other patients who are using the plant for similar medical conditions, and to develop their own model. That's why patient self-titration is so crucial, because patients will start, with that adage of start low and go slow, and they'll gradually titrate up their dose until they find that best fit, until they find the best fit in terms of the phenotype of cannabis you're talking about, what's the best formulation. There's only one state that I work with right now, New York, tried to implement a system. Their regs said that physicians would include dosing, formulation, and duration of treatment. And the problem with that is that the DEA perceives that type of language. If you force physicians to document the dose of the cannabis, the formulation, the delivery method, things like that, that is tantamount to prescribing in the eyes of the DEA. So the DEA then will step in and advise you to change that language. So I would just encourage you to be careful, because that's what happened in New York, is that language had to be changed. I would just encourage you to start a dialogue with your DEA office as early as possible to come up with some compromise language. But it's crucial right now in these other states, in the 20 plus other states, physicians all they're doing is confirming that a patient has a qualifying condition. They're not giving any details about how to use the cannabis. I mean, they may do that informally with the patient. When they're in a session with them, they may advise them, hey, I'd like you to use, to strive for a cannabis that's rich in CBD. I'd like you to use this, to vaporize and not smoke. I'd like, they may give them informal consultation, but to document that on paper and then have that in a official record would put their DEA registrant status in jeopardy. And that's the position of the DEA, is that they're not allowed. Anytime that language has been seen about trying to force physicians to have that, it's always gotten thrown out so far.
Follow-up question, Representative Silver?
Yes, thank you. Are doctors following the patient along the way for every step of the process, or are people trial and erroring on their own?
recognized?
It's up to the physician. So the physicians can mandate with the patient that, hey, I'd like you to come in monthly for follow-up visits, and I want to, continue to follow all of your experience with the cannabis. Some physicians only see the patient once a year.